Welcome to Eurasia on the Move, the podcast series that deals with current trends and developments in the Eurasia region, so the countries of Central Asia, the Southern Caucasus, and Eastern Europe. What is happening in these countries, for example regarding civil society, democratization, the rule of law, and human rights? We talk to experts who are closely monitoring developments that move the region. This helps us to better understand these developments, how they affect the region, and what that means for the European Union's relations with the countries. This podcast is hosted by the Eurasia Lab Fellowship program, organized by the Institut für Europäische Politik in Berlin.
Hi, I'm Yvonne Braun and I'm a research associate at IEP. I am excited to host our very first episode of Eurasia on the Move. Today we will take a look at Belarus. Last year, this country has gained the attention of the whole world as mass protests emerged after the presidential election. In August 2020, Alexander Lukashenko, the dictator who has led Belarus for almost 3 decades, claimed to have won the election against Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Both international and local observers reported strong irregularities and called it a rigged election. The election sparked mass protests in the capital Minsk and beyond, but President Lukashenko is holding on to power by employing violence and repression to silence his opponents. I want to learn more about the situation in the country. This is why I have invited Vasil Navumau from the Center for Advanced Internet Studies in Bochum and Olga Matveyeva from the Institute for Public Administration in Dnipro. They are fellows of the Eurasia Lab Fellowship program and analyze civic initiatives in Belarus that emerged after the presidential election 2020 in order to facilitate peaceful conflict regulation in the country. Thanks for joining us, Olga and Vasil. What's the situation in Belarus at the moment?
Well, at the moment we still observe protests in the whole country. The scope and intensity of protest is substantially lower than it was in autumn. And the main reasons for this are freezing temperatures and tiredness of the participants and the brutal measures of the authorities. So still the protest movement is very much alive, and the Belarusians do not seem to be ready to come to terms with the lawlessness and violence occurring in the country. At this moment, there are around 200 political prisoners, 8 protest-related deaths, and more than 400 of documented tortures, and more than 30,000 of citizens that went through the prisons. And the law enforcement agents continue brutally arresting and beating protesters.
Vasil, you are originally from Belarus. I guess it is hard for any outsider to imagine what's going on there. What has it been like for you to have seen the developments around last year's election unfold in your native country?
Yes, like you say, it's hard to imagine for everyone who is not from Belarus the mixture of enthusiasm and despair experienced by the citizens of the country during the various stages of the protest. First, the degree of repressions is hardly bearable. People are being detained on an everyday basis. They get fined, beaten, arrested, and tortured. 2 my friends were detained simply for walking near the site of protests, and 2 more received 15 days of arrest just for being, I cite, too happy while meeting their friends from detention. At this moment, not a single criminal case has been opened concerning human rights violations by law enforcement officers, and more than 900 criminal cases have been brought against political opponents of the government. However, at the same time, for me, the 2020's Belarusian protest has been a revelation. I have never thought that such a level of solidarity, persistence, and courage was possible in my home country. Since the first protest action I have been a participant, I think it was in 2001, I have been waiting for when the Belarusians as one will raise their voices against the authoritarianism. In August, it finally happened, and we saw that more than 200,000 people came to the streets on August 16th. And it has been occurring on an everyday basis for more than 160 days. It's just simply unbelievable.
The two of you have been working on protest movements before, both in Belarus and in other countries in Eastern Europe. What is special about the case of Belarus?
Well, this peaceful aspiration towards democracy mentioned in Belarus for 26 years now, and the Belarusian people will not stop until Lukashenko resigns. People believe that he's responsible for the mass falsifications, violence, and lies in response to the dangers of COVID-19 pandemic. This time, people's patience came to an end. The protest mood is so strong that even the brutal beatings and the tortures are not able to destroy them. And I believe that there is no way back. According to the latest polls, they are ready to protest as long as it is necessary. And I'm sure that we will reach the main goal, to conduct new presidential elections and make Lukashenko resign. I have never seen such a level of determination and resilience. Also, what is also important, I think, is that Western countries took a unified position against Lukashenko's regime. They introduced sanctions and other measures to stop the violence in Belarus. I believe that such support inspires the protests in Belarus. It serves as additional evidence that the West shares the aims and the values of the movement.
You seem to be dedicating a lot of time and effort into researching protest movements. What got you interested in this kind of research in the first place?
I became interested in researching protest movements because of my personal experience. The Revolution of Dignity, or Ukrainian Euromaidan, has had a decisive impact maybe on my academic and even working career, actually making me realize how important social movements could be, and actually they are. They do not only influence political agenda setting in Ukraine, not only attracting attention to the problems that have not been previously seen, but that is more important for me, they also contribute to the change of values and transformation of norms of our society.
What about you, Vasil?
Well, for me, I can say that I've been interested in the protest movements my whole adult life. In 2004, the authorities, from the personal approval of Lukashenko, closed the European Humanitarian University where I was a student, hereby violating my right for education. And since this time, have been actively participating in the mass protests in Belarus, demanding the resignation of the current president. However, probably the most important protest action for me took place in 2006. Back then, the Belarusians thought that the change could occur as a result of the peaceful electoral revolution. That is why we pitched the tent camp on the Kostrichnitskaya Square, one of the main squares of Minsk. Still, it was destroyed by the authorities 4 days later, and a lot of protesters were arrested. And still, the remarkable experience of participating in the protest with my friends made me believe that the change is possible, because there are so many people around me who desire the same. And after taking part in almost every major protest action during the decade, I became interested in the mechanisms of mobilization. And in other words, my activist experience inspired me to learn more about social movements, to reflect on the specificity of protests in Belarus, and eventually it inspired me to become an expert on the topic. That is why first I made my master thesis and then PhD thesis in this topic. And that is why the current way of protest actions for me is important both on personal and professional levels.
That brings us to your current research project. You want to take a closer look at the civic and political initiatives that emerged in Belarus after the election of last August. What is the aim and the approach of your research project?
Our aim is actually to trace current civic initiatives. As we know, they massively emerged during the upsurge of the mass mobilization after the falsification of the presidential elections in August 2020, and we strive to identify possible directions of further social and political development of Belarus. from the grassroots level. And some of these initiatives target the literal absence of civil rights, but others the necessity to support and re-educate former public officials who have lost their jobs on a political grounds. Our project relies on the triangulation of methods to suggest a thorough analysis of the problem mentioned above. In particular, we are looking to implement the following steps. We will identify a set of relevant events to be considered through the lens of event analysis methodology. So first we will consider the topical media reports emerged in the key Belarusian newspapers within the period between August and April 2020. And on the second stage, we will analyze the media discourse to reveal nodal points of the strategic narratives in Belarusian civic activism in the aspiration to promote democratic values and retain the country's position in the Eastern European initiative, we mean qualitative stage. And third, we will conduct the in-depth semi-structured interviews with European Union decision makers, Belarusian and Ukrainian civic activists, which will allow us establishing the links between the relevant stakeholders and formulating recommendations to the European Union and Ukrainian funds, organizations and policymakers on possible transformations, proceeding from the Ukrainian and European experience.
Wow, that sounds like an ambitious but also very interesting project, and we are looking forward to the results. Speaking of which, do you already have some initial results? For example, regarding the organization of the Belarusian movement and the main similarities compared to the Ukrainian one?
I believe that the biggest commonality of the Ukrainian and Belarusian movements has been certainly main goal to overthrow the current political regime and democratize the public administration system. And this goal has determined the peaceful character of protests in both cases. We're speaking about the early stages of the Ukrainian protests, surely. The same could be said, by the way, about the Russian protest movement developing these days. Although the formal aim is the investigation of corruption in the highest administration and the arrest of Navalny, in the end, the aim is the same, overthrowing of authoritarian regime and the subsequent democratization. Second, speaking about the commonalities between the Ukrainian and Belarusian movements, at the initial stages of the revolutions, people formed solidarity networks. They gathered at the central squares of major cities where they could voice their demands to the authorities and media. At the later stages, protests in Belarus became more decentralized because of the harsh repressions used by authorities.
So what are their main differences?
As for differences, the most evident one, the polarization of society in Ukraine. There are clearly cut pro-Russian and pro-European camps, as opposed to the Belarusian protests and society, which seems to be more homogeneous. And the geopolitical choice has been always a secondary issue for Belarusians during their current protest. Second, the Belarusian protest is leaderless and decentralized, as opposed to the Ukrainian one, where leaders played major role and Maidan was the center of protest. Third, during the hot phase of protest, the Ukrainians gave a firm and sometimes violent response to the repressions, while Belarusians prefer a peaceful scenario. But still, the Belarusian protest is still developing and we don't know what will happen next. So we're waiting and closely following the events in my home country.
The research project, in 3 words.
If I had to describe, or we had described our project in 3 words, we would prefer consistent, peaceful, and value-oriented. Consistent just because neither brutal violence nor freezing temperatures can stop Belarusians in their movement against the authoritarianism in their native country. Second, peaceful, as despite the harsh repressions, there were no cases of Belarusians engaged in violence, riots, or any other forms of disorderly conduct. And actually value-oriented because the protest appears to be the symbol of deep transformations occurring in the society.
With Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, a woman was the main opponent of President Lukashenko in the election, but also more in general, women were quite visible during the protests. Why is that, and what role does it play?
Indeed, women became a very, very extremely important part of the protest movement. For instance, Maria Kolesnikova and Veronika Tsepkalo, and of course Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. To my mind, women's activism is a logical response to the inefficient measures of Belarusian authorities to cope with the pandemic, rigged elections, and brutal violence against the Belarusians. As a result, women's chains of solidarity, where hundreds of women all around Belarus come out on Saturdays to march with white clothes with flowers in their hands, became most remarkable and maybe a beautiful action of that period. Women dressed in this way peacefully walks around cities, and their visibility helps to push forward the message that women's voice matter in Belarus in the first time, because traditionally in Belarus, before the latest protest, a woman was perceived by society and by authorities as a much less important person than a man. That is why Belarusians see Svetlana as one of them, a woman who was a traditional wife and mom and managed to become now a recognizable political leader who is recognized not only in Belarus. That brings them a hope, showed that their voice could be important too. And Svetlana Tikhanovskaya became an example for Belarusian women, showing that everything is possible if you act consistently in solidarity with others. That is why we name this revolution like Revolution of Consistency. But at the same time, I am actually not sure that such an active involvement of women will change the attitudes of Belarusian people immediately. The Belarusian society remains largely patriarchal, and at this point the Belarusian society is unified in its aspiration to the political transformations. But the process of changing the value orientation of society, as well as getting rid of stereotypes associated with gender roles, could take several years.
I am curious to know how the developments in Belarus are embedded in the broader European context. Can they have an impact on their EU and non-EU neighbors?
Yes, we think the process is highly relevant for the Eastern European region. First, because the situation in Belarus is crucially important for the relations between Russia and the European Union. As you know, Belarus has always been Russia's main ally, with Lukashenko always publicly putting forward the narrative of brotherly peoples who have the same values and aspirations. Also, Belarus holds strategic position, being the buffer between Poland and Russia, and hence Russia would have liked to retain the country within its orbit of influence. That is why Kremlin indirectly supports Belarusian authoritarian regime with various resources. Probably this is one of the reasons that the Belarusian protest is almost devoid of geopolitical dimension. There were hardly any Russian or the European Union flags seen at the collective actions. This is simply the secondary issues for Belarusians because they are determined to overthrow the authoritarian incumbent and only after that to solve other problems. Not least of all, this is the case as the leaders of the protests, for example, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and her team, are aware of the threat of Russian involvement. Every protest somehow gains anti-Russian connotation. And that is why, in our view, for the European Union, it is very important to act very cautiously, but at the same time decisively in their attempts to solve the Belarusian crisis.
The Belarusian opposition has recently been awarded the Sakharov Prize by the EU that comes with a €50,000 endowment. Do you think that this will have any impact? What can EU and European democracies generally do to support the democratic movements in Belarus?
I believe that their attention to the activity of Ms. Tikhanovskaya, reflections of Maria Kolesnikova, who is currently in prison, blogger Nekta, and others, is really important both for us, Belarusians, and the Eastern European region as a whole. It is inspiring that the eyes of the Western countries are on us, on our quest for peaceful change and struggle against the brutal repressions, pacifications, and blatant lies. I think that Sakharov Prize is a wonderful opportunity to demonstrate the solidarity of the Western countries with the Belarusian people and send a strong signal to the rest of the world on no recognition of Lukashenko's legitimacy. Speaking about the further steps that the European Union and the European democracy could undertake to support democratic movement in Belarus, I think that, first of all, they could implement further steps on expansion of sanction lists on the national level, lobby for wider sanctions on the European level, raising Belarusian agenda on the international level. I believe that each country should freeze imports from Belarusian state-owned companies, which are the economic base of the regime. Second, I think that it is important to apply the Moscow mechanism and also the principle of universal jurisdictions to prosecute those complicit in excessive violence against the protesters. I believe it's also important to impose travel ban on them to guarantee their international isolation. Third, what can be done is to facilitate the simplification of visa issuance for Belarusians who suffered from the regime, provide financial and organization assistance to students expelled from the university, and also teachers who lost their jobs, as well as to other groups of society. Fourth, I think that it's also important to allocate finances for the independent media, providing unbiased information about the atrocities of the regime.
Reflecting on what we have discussed in this podcast, it may still seem a big question, but what do you think are the prospects for democratization in Belarus right now? What are the chances of success for the movements that you cover in your research?
Success of the protest will depend on a range of factors. First, the level of civic activism, of course, and the determination of society for change should remain the same. Currently, we witness the decrease of the mass character of protest movement, but we anticipate the revival of activity in March, which is traditionally such a hot time for Belarusian protest cycle. Second, we suppose that a lot depends on growing cracks within the seeming monolith of the Siloviki group, it's Belarusian police, who's serving President Lukashenko, which still remains loyal to Lukashenko. So currently several civic initiatives are trying to deal with it, with BIPOL, or Belarusian police, being the most efficient one, being launched by former law enforcement agents. They are currently trying to convince the police officers to resign and join the protesters. And third, the unified and decisive response of an international community, like Vasil mentioned, is extremely important for further demolition of the authoritarian system. All the Vasil mentioned above, sanctions, international isolation and persecution of those involved in the act of violence, along with the support of all the victims of repression, should be at the top of international political agenda. Speaking about the democratization of Belarus, I personally have a lot of hope in team that is currently working around Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. The same thing is with civic initiatives, which remain sustainable core of social resistance in Belarus. They both have already accomplished a lot, and if they manage to secure the same level of unity and determination, they could build a basis for much needed reforms. The latter will transform the current rigid centralized hierarchical system of power and contribute to building a new democratic Belarus. So the chances of success are extremely high, and they need a consistent pushing all that initiatives forward.
A word of advice for junior researchers.
Given that with our Eurasia Lab Fellowship program and this podcast, we want to inspire young researchers dealing with the Eurasia region, is there a word of advice you can give young colleagues drawing from your personal experience in the field?
Well, sure. Most importantly, I think that it is crucial to be fluent in one or several local languages, because it allows to get an intimate knowledge of the background of each individual country. For this, it is also crucial to follow the news in political economic sphere, because sometimes even the seemingly minor shifts in local, social, economic, and political context could have a decisive impact on the developments in the countries, and hence also condition the trajectory of the research and the methodological tools.
Thanks so much to the two of you for joining us today and for introducing us to the situation in Belarus and your work. We highly appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of Eurasia on the Move. To Today, we got plenty of insights into the developments in Belarus and the protest movements that have built after the election in 2020. You can follow updates on Vasil's and Olga's research project on IAP's website. In the next episode, we will look at Central Asia. Our guests will tell us about the governance crisis in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, and how civil society organizations try to step in. This episode was produced by Yvonne Braun, David Gottheit, and Marlise Murray from IEP. Our special thanks goes to today's guests, Vasil Navumau and Olga Matveeva. Thank you very much for listening, and stay tuned for our next episode.